Get on your knees. Officer Eric Dalton's voice cut through the morning traffic like a command no one dared question. Theodore Jackson stopped walking. His gray suit was perfectly pressed, his blue tie neatly centered beneath his collar, and a leather folder rested calmly beneath his arm. He looked at the officer, then at the sidewalk beneath his polished shoes. "Excuse me?" Theodore asked. Dalton stepped forward. "I said get on your knees." People nearby slowed down. A woman carrying a coffee stared. A delivery driver stopped beside his truck. Someone quietly raised a phone. Theodore was 63 years old. His hair was silver at the temples, his posture straight, his expression controlled. He had spent decades learning how to remain calm when other people wanted him to lose control. "Officer," he said evenly, "I am not resisting you." Dalton's eyes narrowed. "I didn't ask if you were resisting." "Then why am I being detained?" Theodore asked. Dalton gave a cold smile. "Because you're walking toward City Hall carrying a bag, and you don't look like you belong there." The words landed harder than the command. Theodore glanced toward the massive stone building only 2 blocks away. "I have an appointment." Dalton laughed. "Sure you do." Theodore said nothing. "Show me your identification." Theodore reached slowly into his jacket and handed over his driver's license. Dalton barely looked at it before handing it back. "This doesn't tell me why you're going to City Hall." Theodore's eyes remained fixed on him. "It doesn't need to." Dalton stepped closer. "You people always think having a piece of plastic means you can do whatever you want." A silence fell over the sidewalk. Theodore's jaw tightened for half a second. Then it relaxed. He could have ended the encounter with one phone call. He could have identified himself. He could have told the officer exactly who he was. But he didn't. Instead, he asked the question that would later become the center of the entire investigation. "Officer Dalton, are you detaining me because I've committed a crime?" Dalton's expression hardened. "I'm telling you to cooperate. I'm asking a simple question. Turn around." "Why?" "Turn around now." Dalton reached for the leather folder. Theodore pulled it gently against his chest. "Don't touch that." Dalton's face changed. "Now you're giving me orders?" He grabbed Theodore's arm. Gasps rose from the sidewalk. The folder nearly slipped from Theodore's hand. "Easy," Theodore said quietly. "I am not your enemy." Dalton twisted his arm behind his back. The handcuffs came out. Click. One cuff closed around Theodore's wrist. Click. The second followed. Theodore looked toward the small camera mounted on Dalton's chest. For the first time, something almost unreadable passed across his face. Not fear. Not anger. Recognition. He knew exactly what that camera meant. Every word. Every gesture. Every second. All of it was being recorded. Dalton didn't notice. He was too busy congratulating himself for putting another suspicious black man in his place. "You're going to explain yourself downtown," Dalton said. Theodore looked toward City Hall again. The building stood in the morning sunlight, its tall windows glowing above the street. Inside, dozens of people were already waiting for a meeting scheduled to begin in less than 10 minutes. They were waiting for one man, Theodore Jackson, the mayor of Riverton. And Officer Eric Dalton had just handcuffed him on the sidewalk without knowing that the man he believed did not belong inside City Hall was the highest elected official in the building. Worse still, Theodore had been walking there that morning for one reason: to review complaints about the police department. And now, without realizing it, Dalton had just created the most powerful piece of evidence Theodore could have asked for. The cold metal around Theodore Jackson's wrists seemed almost absurd against the warmth of the morning sun. He stood beside Officer Eric Dalton's patrol car while traffic continued moving behind them. Horns sounding, buses rolling past, people hurrying toward work as though nothing unusual was happening. But on the sidewalk, everything had changed. Theodore was no longer simply a man walking toward City Hall. He was a black man in handcuffs, surrounded by strangers watching him as if a crime had already been proven. Dalton opened the rear door of the patrol car. "Get in." Theodore looked at the cramped back seat, then at Dalton. "You still haven't told me what crime I've committed." Dalton shook his head. You really want to make this difficult, don't you? I want to understand why I'm being detained. You were acting suspicious. That's not a crime. Dalton's face tightened. I decide what looks suspicious. Theodore took a slow breath. The sentence said more than Dalton realized. A second officer, Rebecca Lawson, had arrived in another patrol vehicle. She was younger than Dalton, but unlike him, she didn't immediately approach Theodore. She looked at the cuffs, then at Dalton. What's going on? Dalton answered before Theodore could speak. Suspicious individual heading toward City Hall. Refused to cooperate. Rebecca glanced at Theodore. His suit was immaculate. His posture remained calm despite the cuffs. There was something about him that didn't fit Dalton's description. Did you run his ID? She asked. Dalton held up the driver's license. Yeah. Rebecca looked at it. And clean. Then why is he detained? Dalton's expression hardened. Because I said so. Rebecca hesitated. Theodore noticed it. So did several people standing nearby. A woman holding a phone whispered, "He's not even fighting them." Another man raised his camera higher. Dalton noticed the phones and turned toward the crowd. Keep moving. This is police business. The command only made more people stop. Theodore remained silent. His eyes drifted toward the leather folder Dalton had nearly taken from him. A corner of a document was visible inside. At the top, in bold letters, were the words, Police Department Accountability Review. Dalton noticed it too. What's that? He asked. Theodore said nothing. Dalton reached for the folder again. I asked you a question. It's private material. Not anymore. Dalton snatched the folder from Theodore's hand. Rebecca's eyes widened slightly. Eric. Dalton ignored her. He opened the folder. Page after page contained reports, budget figures, complaint summaries, and handwritten notes. Then he saw a heading that made him pause. Internal Review Riverton. Police Department. Dalton's confidence returned almost immediately. So you're investigating us now? Theodore finally looked directly into his eyes. I'm reviewing information. Dalton laughed. You think you're some kind of investigator? Theodore didn't answer. Dalton flipped another page. You don't have clearance to look at police records. Rebecca stepped closer. Maybe we should verify who he is before we go any further. Dalton snapped. I already verified him. You verified his driver's license, Rebecca replied. That's not the same thing. For a moment, silence settled between them. Theodore looked at Rebecca. She was the first person that morning who had asked the right question. Officer Lawson, he said quietly. I appreciate your concern. Dalton turned sharply. Don't start playing officers against each other. Theodore's eyes returned to him. I'm not playing anything. Dalton shoved the folder against the roof of the car. Then get inside. Theodore didn't move. Officer Dalton, I am asking you one final time. Am I under arrest? Dalton stared at him. Then he leaned closer and lowered his voice. You should have thought about that before you decided you belonged here. Theodore's expression didn't change. But somewhere beneath that calm exterior, a decision had already been made. He would not identify himself. Not yet, because he wanted to know exactly how far Eric Dalton was willing to go when he believed the man in front of him had no power. And as Dalton closed the patrol car door, the body camera continued recording every word. The patrol car remained parked beneath the bright morning sun, but inside the cramped back seat, Theodore Jackson felt the atmosphere becoming heavier with every passing second. His hands were still cuffed behind him. His leather folder was now sitting on the front passenger seat beside Officer Eric Dalton, who seemed unusually interested in the documents he had taken. Rebecca Lawson stood outside the vehicle watching through the window. Something about the situation bothered her. She had been a police officer long enough to know the difference between a legitimate detention and an officer looking for a reason to justify one. Theodore had done nothing aggressive. He had raised his voice at no one. He had tried to answer every question. Yet Dalton had continued pushing. Rebecca walked toward the driver's window. Eric, we should call dispatch and confirm the situation. Dalton looked at her through the glass. I already told you. Suspicious individual. That's not an identity, Rebecca said. Dalton frowned. What are you getting at? I'm saying we should verify him. Dalton leaned back in his seat. You questioning my judgment? Rebecca paused. I'm asking you to follow procedure. Inside the car, Theodore heard every word. He looked through the window toward City Hall. The building was now only a few hundred yards away. He could see people entering through the front doors. A black SUV pulled up near the steps. 2 members of his security detail stepped out, scanning the street. Theodore recognized them immediately. They were looking for him. He knew they would soon realize something was wrong. But Theodore remained silent. He had made a choice. If he revealed himself now, Eric Dalton would simply explain everything away as a misunderstanding. He would apologize. Perhaps he would claim he had been following protocol. Perhaps someone would quietly tell Theodore that the officer had only been doing his job. But Theodore had spent years listening to residents describe exactly this kind of encounter. People who were stopped, questioned, doubted, humiliated, then told afterward that it had all been a misunderstanding. He wanted to see what happened when the person being treated that way had no immediate way to escape it. Dalton opened the rear door and crouched slightly. One more question. Theodore looked up. Where do you work? Theodore answered calmly. I work for the city. Dalton smiled. Doing what? Theodore looked at him for a long moment. Public service. Dalton laughed. That's not an answer. Theodore's voice remained steady. It's the most accurate answer you're going to get. Dalton slammed the door shut. Rebecca watched him walk back toward the front of the patrol car. Eric, she said quietly. This doesn't feel right. Dalton looked at her. You know what doesn't feel right? People thinking they can walk into City Hall just because they put on a suit. Rebecca glanced toward Theodore. He's 63. Dalton shrugged. And he's calm. Dalton scoffed. Criminals can be calm. Rebecca didn't answer. Across the street, the woman with the phone was still recording. The footage captured Theodore sitting quietly in the back of the patrol car while Dalton spoke with Rebecca. Another pedestrian had started filming too. None of them knew who Theodore was, but they could see what was happening. Then Theodore's phone began vibrating inside his jacket. Dalton noticed. Who keeps calling you? Theodore looked toward him. Someone expecting me. Tell them you're busy. Theodore almost smiled. He could already imagine the confusion inside City Hall. The meeting was supposed to begin in minutes. His chief of staff, Diane Reynolds, would be looking at the clock. The police chief, William Anderson, would be wondering why the mayor had not arrived. And somewhere inside the building, a presentation was waiting to begin. A presentation about complaints involving officers like Eric Dalton. Then Dalton opened the driver's door and turned toward Rebecca. We're taking him downtown. Rebecca stared at him. For what charge? Dalton hesitated. We'll figure that out. Those 4 words changed everything. Theodore heard them clearly. He lowered his eyes for a moment, then looked directly into the body camera mounted on Dalton's chest. This time he held the gaze for several seconds. We'll figure that out. The camera recorded it. Theodore knew it. Rebecca knew it. But Eric Dalton still didn't understand that the strongest witness in the entire encounter was sitting less than 2 feet away from him. And it was wearing his own badge. Take him out. Officer Eric Dalton opened the rear door of the patrol car and reached for Theodore Jackson's arm. Theodore stepped out slowly, the metal cuffs still locked around his wrists. The morning crowd had grown larger now. People were no longer simply walking past. They were watching. Some held phones at chest level. Others stood several feet away, whispering to one another. Theodore could feel dozens of eyes following him, but he kept his face composed. Dalton grabbed his elbow. Move. Theodore looked at him. I can walk. Then walk. Dalton pulled harder than necessary. Theodore stumbled half a step before regaining his balance. Rebecca Lawson immediately noticed. Eric, ease up. Dalton turned toward her. Stay out of it. Theodore said nothing. He looked toward City Hall again. The front steps were now crowded with employees arriving for work. One man in a dark suit stopped near the entrance and looked across the street. Theodore recognized him. It was Thomas Grant, the city manager. Thomas looked confused. He had been expecting the mayor upstairs. Theodore gave him the smallest shake of his head. Not yet. Thomas hesitated, then disappeared through the doors. Dalton noticed the exchange. Who was that? Someone I know. How do you know him? Theodore remained silent. Dalton stepped directly in front of him. I'm talking to you. Theodore looked at the officer's badge. You have my identification. You have my belongings. You have my cooperation. What exactly are you still looking for? Dalton's expression hardened.
Attitude.
Rebecca looked away for a moment, visibly uncomfortable. Theodore almost couldn't believe what he had heard. Attitude? He repeated. Yes. Dalton pointed toward the patrol car. Get back in. Theodore didn't move immediately. Officer Dalton, I have somewhere I need to be. Not anymore. People are waiting for me. Dalton smirked. I'm sure they are. Then he looked toward City Hall. Maybe they can wait. The words were quiet, but the humiliation was unmistakable. Theodore had spent years hearing citizens tell him how powerless they felt during encounters with law enforcement. He had listened to mothers describe their sons being treated as threats simply because of how they looked. He had listened to elderly residents say they were afraid to ask questions when officers stopped them. Now he was standing inside one of those moments himself. The difference was that Theodore knew something Dalton did not. This encounter was being documented from every angle. The body camera on Dalton's chest was recording. The phones across the street were recording. And somewhere inside City Hall, security cameras were recording too. Dalton reached for Theodore's shoulder. Enough. Theodore's voice dropped. Officer, don't. Dalton stopped for half a second. Is that a threat? No. Theodore looked directly into his eyes. It's a warning. Dalton laughed. You think you're intimidating me? Theodore shook his head.
No.
I think you don't understand what you're doing. Dalton stepped closer. I know exactly what I'm doing. Then he pushed Theodore toward the car. Rebecca finally stepped between them. Eric, that's enough. Dalton stared at her. You want to defend him? Rebecca's voice remained calm. I want you to follow procedure. Dalton pointed toward Theodore. He's refusing lawful instructions. Rebecca looked at Theodore. Are you refusing? Theodore answered honestly. No. Then what's the problem? Dalton snapped. The problem is that he keeps acting like he's above me. Theodore looked at Rebecca. I'm not above anyone. A pause. I'm simply asking to be treated like everyone else. The sentence silenced the small crowd. Even Rebecca lowered her eyes. Dalton, however, seemed more irritated than ever. He grabbed the folder from the hood and opened it again. This time, a document slipped loose and landed on the pavement. Rebecca bent down and picked it up. Her eyes moved across the page. Then her expression changed. At the top were the words, Confidential, Police Department Performance Review. Beneath them was a date. Tomorrow's date. Rebecca looked at Theodore, then at Dalton. She suddenly understood that Theodore's trip to City Hall had something to do with the department. But she still didn't know the biggest secret of all. The man in handcuffs was not merely going to a meeting. He was the person who had authorized it. And Officer Eric Dalton was unknowingly dragging the mayor closer and closer to the evidence that could end his career. The document lay in Rebecca Lawson's hand, but she could barely take her eyes off the heading. Confidential, Police Department Performance Review. The date beneath it was tomorrow. She looked at Theodore Jackson, then at Officer Eric Dalton. Where did you get this? She asked. Theodore answered calmly. It belongs to the city. Dalton reached for it. Give me that. Rebecca pulled it slightly away. Eric, wait. Dalton's expression hardened. I said give it to me. It's a city document, Rebecca replied. And you took it from a detained civilian. Dalton scoffed. He's carrying police records. Theodore corrected him quietly. They are not police records. They are public accountability documents prepared for tomorrow's meeting. Dalton looked at him. So you admit you came here to investigate us? Theodore stared at him. I came to City Hall for a meeting. About the police department. Among other things. Dalton laughed under his breath. There it is. He stepped closer. You think you're some kind of inspector? Theodore remained completely still. No. Then who gave you authority to carry those documents? Theodore looked toward City Hall. The city did. Dalton shook his head. You keep talking like you have some kind of position. Theodore's eyes returned to him. Everyone has a position. The question is whether they use it responsibly. Dalton rolled his eyes. Enough with the speeches. He turned toward Rebecca. Put him back in the car. Rebecca hesitated. Eric, we still haven't established a charge. Dalton's voice became colder. Obstruction. Failure to comply. Suspicious activity. Take your pick. Rebecca stared at him. Those aren't interchangeable. They are today. Theodore heard the sentence and looked briefly toward the body camera. Once again, his expression changed almost imperceptibly. He knew this moment mattered, not because of who he was, but because of what Dalton was revealing about himself. Dalton noticed Theodore's glance. What are you looking at? Nothing. You keep looking at that camera. Theodore said nothing. Dalton stepped closer. You think that camera is going to save you? Theodore finally answered. I think it records what happens. Dalton smiled. Exactly. And right now it records you refusing to cooperate. Theodore's voice remained quiet. Does it also record why you stopped me? Dalton froze for a second. Rebecca looked at him. That's a fair question. Dalton turned toward her. Whose side are you on? I'm on the side of procedure. Dalton shook his head. Then do your job. Rebecca looked down at the document again. Her eyes caught a section near the bottom. There was a list of upcoming recommendations. Independent review of officer complaints, body camera compliance audits, revised disciplinary procedures, and an investigation into repeated allegations of racial profiling. Rebecca swallowed. She looked at Theodore again. Suddenly, she understood why the document was important. This wasn't some random civilian carrying paperwork. Whoever Theodore was, he was connected to something much bigger than a morning traffic stop. Mr. Jackson, she said carefully. May I ask who you are? Theodore looked at her. For the first time, Dalton seemed interested in the answer. Theodore could have said it. One sentence. One name. One title. That would end everything. But instead, he simply replied, I'm someone who believes officers should be held accountable for how they treat people. Dalton laughed. That's not an answer. Theodore nodded. Maybe not. He looked toward City Hall once more. But you'll have your answer soon. Dalton grabbed the folder and shoved it beneath his arm. You're done talking. He opened the patrol car door. Get inside. Theodore stepped toward the car. But before he entered, his eyes met Rebecca's. She saw no fear in them. No desesperación. Only patience. And for the first time that morning, Rebecca began to wonder whether Eric Dalton had made a mistake far greater than simply stopping the wrong man. Because the document in her hand had not been the most dangerous thing Theodore Jackson was carrying. The most dangerous thing was the truth about who he was. Theodore Jackson sat quietly in the back of the patrol car, his cuffed hands resting behind him as the minutes slipped away. Outside, Officer Eric Dalton spoke into his radio, apparently preparing to transport him downtown. Rebecca Lawson remained near the sidewalk, still holding the confidential document she had found. But then she heard something that made her turn. Unit 12, respond. The voice from dispatch sounded unusually.
Urgent.
City Hall security requesting immediate contact regarding an individual detained outside the building. Dalton reached for his radio. Unit 12, copy. Rebecca looked toward City Hall. Several black SUVs were now pulling toward the curb. Men and women in business attire stepped out quickly. A few security officers moved across the sidewalk, scanning the area. Dalton frowned. What's going on? Rebecca didn't answer. She was watching one woman in a navy suit walking rapidly toward them. Diane Reynolds, Chief of Staff to the Mayor. Diane stopped several feet away and looked directly at the patrol car. Her expression changed the instant she saw Theodore through the window. Oh my God! She walked forward. Mr. Jackson? Dalton stepped between her and the vehicle. Ma'am, you need to stay back. Diane stared at him. Where is the man you detained? Dalton pointed toward the back seat. He's being taken downtown. Diane looked through the window again. Her face went pale. You have got to be kidding me. Dalton frowned. Do you know him? Diane looked at him as though the question itself were unbelievable. Know him? She took a breath. Officer, what exactly did you do? Dalton's confidence began to fade. He's being detained for suspicious activity. Diane looked at Rebecca, then back at Dalton. What is his name? Theodore Jackson. Diane closed her eyes for half a second. And you put him in handcuffs? Dalton said nothing. Diane stepped closer. Officer, I need you to open that door. Dalton shook his head. He's under detention. Open the door. Her voice was no longer polite. Now. Dalton looked toward Rebecca. Rebecca quietly said, Eric, maybe we should. No, Dalton's voice was firm. We don't release detainees because someone from City Hall tells us to. Diane stared at him. Someone from City Hall? She almost laughed, but there was no humor in it.
I'm Diane Reynolds.
Dalton waited. So? Diane looked directly into his eyes. I'm the mayor's chief of staff. Dalton's expression shifted. Okay. Diane pointed toward the patrol car. And the man sitting in the back is the reason I'm standing here. Dalton looked confused. You mean he's connected to the mayor? Diane took one step closer. He's not connected to the mayor. She paused. He is the mayor. Silence. Even the traffic seemed distant for a moment. Rebecca slowly lowered the document in her hand. Dalton stared through the rear window. Theodore was still sitting there calmly. He wasn't shouting. He wasn't demanding release. He wasn't trying to explain himself. He simply looked back at Dalton. Dalton's face drained of color. That's... He stopped. Diane continued. Mayor Theodore Jackson was scheduled to meet with the police chief, the city manager, and the oversight committee 10 minutes ago. Dalton looked at the folder under his arm, then at the cuffs, then at the body camera on his chest. Why didn't he tell me? Diane's expression hardened. He shouldn't have needed to. Those words struck harder than anything else that morning. Theodore finally spoke from inside the car. Diane. She turned. Yes, Mr. Mayor? Theodore's voice remained calm. Please don't interfere. Diane looked stunned. Sir. Let the process continue. Dalton stared at him. You want this to continue? Theodore looked directly into the camera on Dalton's chest. Yes. Rebecca understood before Dalton did. The mayor had known exactly what he was doing. He had deliberately allowed the encounter to continue because he wanted the truth recorded. Theodore leaned back against the seat. Officer Dalton, he said quietly. You asked me who gave me authority to carry those documents. A pause. Now you know. Dalton stood frozen beside the open door. Theodore continued. But knowing who I am is not the important part. He looked at Rebecca, then at the camera. The important part is what you did before you knew. And suddenly, the humiliation Dalton had inflicted on a stranger that morning no longer looked like a simple mistake. It looked like evidence. For several seconds, no one moved. Officer Eric Dalton stood beside the patrol car with one hand still resting on the open door, staring at Theodore Jackson as if the man sitting behind the glass had somehow become someone else. But Theodore had not changed. He was still wearing the same charcoal gray suit, the same blue tie, the same calm expression. The only thing that had changed was what Dalton now knew. Rebecca Lawson slowly stepped toward the patrol car. Mr. Mayor, she said quietly. I'm sorry. Theodore looked at her through the open door. Officer Lawson, you have nothing to apologize for. Rebecca glanced at Dalton. I should have stopped this sooner. Theodore shook his head. You questioned it. That's what matters. Dalton swallowed hard. Mayor Jackson, I didn't know. Theodore looked directly at him. I know. If I had known who you were, Theodore interrupted gently. That's exactly the problem. Dalton stopped talking. Diane Reynolds stood nearby, arms folded, watching him carefully. Officer Dalton, she said. You keep saying you didn't know who he was, but you knew he was a citizen. Dalton looked away. Yes. You knew he wasn't resisting. Yes. You knew his identification was clean. Dalton said nothing. You knew you had no confirmed charge when you told your partner you would figure one out. Dalton's face tightened. I was trying to secure the situation. Diane pointed toward the body camera. Then the recording will show that. The words seemed to drain whatever confidence remained in him. Dalton looked at the camera on his chest. For the first time, it no longer looked like protection. It looked like a witness. Then a black SUV pulled up beside the curb. Police Chief William Anderson stepped out. He was a broad-shouldered man in his late 50s, wearing a dark suit beneath his department coat. His expression was serious as he walked toward the group.
Mayor Jackson.
Theodore nodded. Chief. Anderson looked at the cuffs. His face hardened. Who authorized this detention? Dalton opened his mouth. Nothing came out. Rebecca answered quietly. Officer Dalton initiated it. Anderson looked at Dalton. On what grounds? Dalton hesitated. Suspicious behavior. Anderson glanced at Theodore. What behavior? Dalton had no answer. Theodore spoke before the silence became unbearable. I was walking to City Hall. Anderson looked at the folder in Dalton's hand. And the documents? Dalton handed it over. Anderson opened the folder and saw the police. Department Performance Review. His eyes stopped at the first page. Mayor, this is tomorrow's oversight packet. Theodore nodded. It was supposed to be reviewed this morning with you, Thomas Grant, and the Oversight Committee. Anderson slowly closed the folder. Then he looked at Dalton. Did you read these documents? Dalton's face went pale. I only looked at them. While detaining the mayor? Dalton didn't answer. Anderson turned toward Theodore. Sir, I can have the cuffs removed immediately. Theodore paused. Then he looked at Dalton. No, everyone stared at him. Diane looked surprised. Mr. Mayor? Theodore's voice remained calm. Leave them on. Dalton's eyes widened. Why? Theodore looked at the body camera. Because the encounter isn't over. Chief Anderson understood. Rebecca understood. Diane understood. Dalton was the only one who still seemed confused. Theodore continued. You believed I needed to prove I belonged in City Hall. He slowly leaned forward. Now I want to know how many other people you have treated the same way simply because you believed they had no power to challenge you. Dalton's lips parted, but no words came. Theodore looked toward the growing crowd. Several phones were still recording. Let them watch. The street became silent again. Theodore finally gave the instruction that would change everything. Take me inside. Chief Anderson nodded. Yes, Mr. Mayor. As the cuffs were finally removed, Theodore stepped out of the patrol car and straightened his jacket. He walked toward City Hall beside the police chief, while Dalton remained behind them. The man who had ordered Theodore onto his knees only minutes earlier now stood watching the mayor enter the building he had claimed Theodore did not belong in. But Dalton still didn't know the worst part. The meeting waiting inside City Hall wasn't being held to discuss a single complaint. It was an emergency review of a pattern. And now, thanks to his own body camera, Officer Eric Dalton had placed himself at the center of it. The doors of City Hall closed behind Theodore Jackson, but the confrontation on the sidewalk was far from over. Inside the main conference room, the atmosphere was tense. Diane Reynolds stood beside a long wooden table covered with folders, tablets, and printed reports. Chief William Anderson took his seat at the head of the room, while Rebecca Lawson remained near the doorway, her expression troubled. Officer Eric Dalton stood alone near the back wall. His uniform suddenly felt heavier than it had that morning. Theodore entered last. He did not sit immediately. He looked around the room at the officials who had been waiting for him, then placed both hands on the table. Let's begin. Thomas Grant, the city manager, looked at Dalton. Is that the officer? Diane nodded. Yes. Thomas opened a folder. Then we have a problem. Dalton swallowed. Sir, this was a misunderstanding. Theodore finally looked at him. A misunderstanding? Dalton nodded quickly. I didn't know you were the mayor. Theodore's expression remained calm. You have said that several times. Dalton hesitated. Because it's true. Theodore walked slowly toward the screen at the front of the room. Then let's examine what happened before you knew. Diane connected a tablet to the screen. The first video appeared. It showed Theodore walking toward City Hall. Then Dalton stepped into his path. The room watched in silence. Get on your knees. Dalton's own voice echoed through the speakers. His face tightened. Theodore continued watching without expression. The video showed the request for identification, the dismissal of the driver's license, the accusations of suspicious behavior, and the moment Dalton grabbed Theodore's arm. Then came the sentence that made everyone in the room uncomfortable. We'll figure out what charge to use. The recording stopped. No one spoke. Dalton looked toward Chief Anderson. I was under pressure. Anderson's voice was cold. From whom? Dalton had no answer. Theodore turned toward him. That's not the only recording. Diane switched to another video. A pedestrian's phone footage showed the same encounter from across the street. Then another clip appeared. This one captured Dalton telling Rebecca, people thinking they can walk into City Hall just because they put on a suit. Rebecca lowered her eyes. She knew. The words were now impossible to deny. Theodore said nothing. He didn't need to. Diane opened another folder. There are 12 prior complaints involving Officer Dalton. Dalton's face changed. Those were reviewed. Thomas corrected him. They were closed. Diane looked at the documents. Without independent investigation. Chief Anderson leaned forward. How many involved black residents? Diane answered, 9. The room became silent again. Dalton looked at Rebecca. You know that's not fair. Rebecca finally spoke. Eric, I heard what you said this morning. Dalton stared at her. You could have stopped it. Rebecca nodded slowly. I should have. Theodore looked at both officers. This meeting was never supposed to be about firing someone because they stopped me. He paused. It was supposed to be about whether the people of this city can trust the officers who serve them. He turned toward the screen. This morning answered part of that question. Dalton's shoulders dropped. Mayor, please. Theodore looked at him. Don't ask me for mercy. Dalton froze. Theodore continued. Ask the people who were treated the way you treated me. Diane placed another document on the table. The Oversight Committee has voted to open a full investigation into the previous complaints. Chief Anderson added, effective immediately, Officer Dalton is suspended pending review. Dalton stared at his badge. His voice became barely audible. You can't do this. Theodore's answer was quiet. You were certain you could do it to me. Dalton looked up. Theodore held his gaze. The difference is, Officer Dalton, I didn't ask for special treatment. He pointed toward the body camera footage still frozen on the screen. I asked for the same protection every citizen deserves. The room fell silent. And for the first time that day, Eric Dalton understood the true weight of his mistake. He had not lost his badge because he stopped the mayor. He had placed his own behavior under a light bright enough for the entire city to see. 3 weeks later, the streets around Riverton City Hall were filled with people. Reporters stood behind barricades, cameras pointed toward the steps, while residents gathered quietly beneath the morning sun. The investigation into Officer Eric Dalton had concluded, but what it uncovered had gone far beyond one traffic stop. 12 previous complaints had been reopened. 9 involved black residents who had described being treated as suspicious without clear cause. Several body camera records had revealed inconsistencies between official reports and what actually happened. The city had announced new independent oversight procedures, mandatory body camera compliance, and a review of every unresolved racial profiling complaint from the previous 5 years. But Theodore Jackson did not stand on the city hall steps to celebrate. He stood there because the people who had been ignored deserved to know that someone had finally listened. Diane Reynolds stood beside him, holding a folder containing the final recommendations. Chief William Anderson stood several steps behind them. Rebecca Lawson was there too, no longer wearing the expression of uncertainty she had carried that morning. Officer Eric Dalton was not there. His badge had been suspended, and his case had been referred for further administrative and legal review. Theodore stepped toward the microphone. The crowd became silent. 3 weeks ago, he began, a police officer stopped me while I was walking to this building. He paused. He did not know I was the mayor. A few people murmured. Theodore continued, but that's not the part one want you to remember. He looked across the crowd. Because if the only lesson from that morning is that he stopped the wrong man, then we have learned nothing. The crowd became completely still. The real question is what happens when the person being stopped is not the mayor. What happens when it is a father, a grandmother, a teenager, a worker coming home after a long shift? His voice remained steady. What happens when they have no title that makes an officer suddenly treat them differently? Rebecca lowered her eyes. She knew exactly what Theodore meant. The crowd listened as he continued. No citizen should need a position of power before their dignity is respected. A wave of applause moved through the people gathered. Outside City Hall, Theodore waited until it faded. Officer Dalton believed the badge gave him authority over the people standing on this street. He looked toward the entrance of the building. But a badge is not a crown. It is a responsibility. Then Theodore turned toward Chief Anderson. And responsibility without accountability is simply power without restraint. Chief Anderson nodded. Theodore took the final report from Diane and held it up. This document does not erase what happened. It does not erase what happened to the people whose complaints were ignored before mine. But it proves something important. He looked directly into the cameras. Truth does not need a powerful person to become true. The crowd fell silent again. Then Theodore lowered the report. That morning, Officer Dalton thought he had stopped a black man who did not belong near City Hall. He paused. He was wrong. Theodore's voice became quieter. He had stopped a citizen. Another pause. And that citizen happened to be the mayor. The crowd erupted in applause. But Theodore did not smile triumphantly. He simply turned toward City Hall and began walking up the steps. Behind him, Rebecca watched in silence. She had learned something too. The most powerful moment that morning had not been when Dalton discovered Theodore's identity. It had been when Theodore refused to use his identity to demand special treatment. He had allowed the same rules Dalton believed in to expose the abuse of those rules. And that was the final irony. Eric Dalton had spent the entire morning believing the badge made him untouchable. In the end, the very badge he trusted became the evidence that brought him down. Theodore disappeared through the doors of City Hall as the cameras continued recording. And somewhere behind those doors, the city began the harder work of rebuilding trust. Because justice had never been about one mayor getting an apology. It was about making sure the next person walking down that sidewalk would not need to be a mayor at all.